Elton John, in my experience. But when you look at pop music, so I shouldn't really say rock and roll, because I want to include everything that, you know, that goes in under the rubric of popular music for the last, since the end of the war, let's say. So that would include, you know, funk, rhythm and blues, God knows everything, jazz. What is particular about all of those musics as distinct from classical music? The first thing that you notice is that it's made by completely different people. Classical music presented a sort of vision of a society which was first of all arranged like a pyramid. Just think about how an orchestra is arranged, where you have composer, conductor, leader of the orchestra, section principals, section sub-principals, rank and file, all those different categories of expertise and intelligence, and with information flowing one way, that way only. There's no real feedback loop. The conductor has control. How is that different from the kind of organization that is suggested by, say, a jazz band or a pop band, where you get 4 people with often quite different levels of expertise who work together in a sort of communalistic, anarchistic, some kind of mixed up, perhaps dictatorial, I don't know, all sorts of ways. Suddenly the idea of organization is different there. There's none of that classical pyramid structure that we were used to. The second thing about pop music is that it came out of a lot of marginal people. Black people, Jews, Irish people, people who weren't part of the power structure of society, actually. Liverpudlians, most of whom are Irish, as it happens. So this is a music that, once again, doesn't come from above, it comes from below, it comes out of the ground, which is, of course, one of the reasons that the classical world found it so hard to deal with it. In fact, the classical world's response to dealing with it was to try to get orchestras to play Beatles songs, which was one of the most disastrous experiments. or to try to get opera singers to sing Negro classical, Negro, what do they call them? Spirituals, Negro spirituals, yes. And you'd hear what had been an earthy live music made into this. Terrible disaster. And of course all the sexuality stripped right out of it. Because the third thing about pop music is that it was about sex and movement. The shock of Elvis wasn't his voice, beautiful though it was. It was his hips. No, it was the fact that in a context where singers were expected to stand like that and maybe raise an arm, Elvis was, you know, doing a lot down there. And suddenly this proposition that this was not the only important part of the body, which of course runs absolutely right through popular music, and which is, again, so annoying to classical people because it looked dirty to them. You know, when you look at, sorry, I like classical music, I just want to say it's history now. But I like it, I like history too. But the stiffness and tightness of classical music is really a denial of the rest of your body. The fact that when you go to a classical concert, you don't cough, for example. What the fuck is that about? Am I not there? This music is presented as though it exists without me. You're not part of it. In fact, Barbara Ehrenreich said something very good. She said rock music represented a rebellion against the role of the audience. She said audience members had learned how to hold themselves in a state of frozen suspension. So that's how it was in classical times. Suddenly, with rock music, the biggest message is you're part of it. Get dancing, take part, you're in it. It's not just about us. There was a brief period in the late 60s when British prog bands would play with their backs to the audience like this. The sort of idea that they were so into the music that they didn't have to pay any attention to you. But it didn't last. By and large, we accept that pop music is a sensual, sexual music. And sexual because it's often about sex as well. You know, it's not an accident, I think, that the whole revolution in how we think about gender and sexuality has happened in the last 50 years, because there's been a whole lot of art about it as well. David Bowie, not least. There's been a whole conversation, really, about who people could be, what you were allowed to be, what you tolerate, and how you feel about people being like that. I mean, tomorrow, I think it is, you have Anoni playing here. So she's a very good example of somebody who has publicly held this conversation, if you like. And how else do we hold those conversations? Really, our impressions about things like that are mostly formed by our cultural experiences. I've thought a lot more about the gender issue since Anthony and the Johnsons became Anoni than I had done for a long time. I started thinking about it and reading about it and talking to other people. It got me interested. And I assume that that's true for a lot of other people as well. So the other thing about pop music is that it's completely sponge-like. Whereas the classical image of progress involved brilliant individuals called geniuses having brilliant new ideas. That isn't sort of what happens in pop music. What happens in pop music is that people steal from everywhere, package it together in new ways, and suddenly something new comes out of that. It's an evolutionary style of working. So revolution to me is classical. It's part of the classical world. The idea that you can change the world with a bomb or with a single brilliant idea like Das Kapital or something like that. I don't think really that's how the world changes, or rather I don't think it's how it profitably changes. It gets itself into quite a big mess like that very often. What I think happens is that evolution happens all the time, and part of the lubricant of evolution is culture. So that's a good phrase. Culture is the lubricant of evolution. Evolution is actually revolutionary. Revolution is chaotic. Another interesting thing about pop music is that it's sort of craft indifferent. By that I mean that you can be a great guitarist, but you don't have to be. One of the bands that influenced me most was the Velvet Underground. I don't think one member of the Velvet Underground would have passed a single audition, because they weren't good players in that sense of what a good player is. You know, they couldn't do the fast stuff. But in pop music, you see all the time bands are formed not only out of people's strengths, but out of their limitations as well. And that, I think, is a very, very beautiful message for how communities might work. We still are stuck with this old idea of the gifted individual being the leader, the person who drags everything else along with them. But in fact, what happens when you notice how communities work is that it's this complex ecosystem between some draggers and some pushers and some pullers. It's not it's not the old pyramid that we inherited from classical times and which still exists in the army and the church and the orchestra and nowhere else as far as I can tell. It's an ecosystem of some kind. Sorry, just looking at the clock there. A lot of the theory of neoliberalism, what I started with, is based, I think, on a misunderstanding of Darwin. So, if you say Darwin to most people, they say, oh yes, survival of the fittest, which in fact Darwin never said, but nonetheless the idea is that the strong individual wins through and that individual's genes become the seed for the next generation, so the species keeps reinventing itself. The problem is that it isn't how things work, really. It certainly isn't how things work in human culture, because humans easily subvert evolution. For instance, I am an example. I should have been dead at least twice in my life, but I was saved by medical science. Well, medical science is not an evolutionary machine. It's a lucky accident that a lot of humans managed to invent together. Probably it's true for most of you. Most of us would not have survived if we were purely subject to the rules of evolution. Somehow we all have. And yet we now find ourselves faced with a whole body of economic theory that talks as though the theory of evolution applies to us humans. It doesn't really anymore. Science